Metroid Prime is an action-adventure game developed by Retro Studios and published by Nintendo for the GameCube back in 2002. The game was the fifth main installment in the Metroid franchise and the first game in the series to use 3D computer graphics and a first-person perspective. At a glance, the game appears to be a first-person shooter, but Nintendo specifically classified it as a first-person adventure, since most of the game is about exploration rather than combat. Like previous games in the series, the player takes control of the bounty hunter and series protagonist, Samus Aran. And the story follows her as she battles her old nemesis, the space pirates, Ridley, and all their Phazon-enhanced experiments on the planet Talon 4. Here, I will now endeavor to chart a 3-act structure given the game's events. Act 1 begins with Samus Aran intercepting a distress signal from the space pirate frigate Orpheon, whose crew have been slaughtered by genetically modified experiments. It's there that Samus, and by proxy the player, discover the game's primary antagonist. And no, it's not Ridley. In fact, the primary antag is the highly radioactive superorganic substance known as Phazon. What follows is the inciting incident. Samus fights and defeats a gigantic parasite, but the resulting explosion will heavily impact her suit as she tries to escape. The damage severely impairs her advanced weaponry and tech. Note that happens sometime after we encounter a newly resurrected Meta Ridley, who makes a surprise appearance and flees toward the nearby planet, Talon 4. And this will coincide with the story's first plot point. Samus is made to follow Meta Ridley and perform a more thorough investigation about what's going on. Act 2 begins, and its first half entails Samus exploring Talon 4. There she discovers the Chozo ruins and the remains of the ancient Chozo civilization. Throughout the game, you are encouraged to scan various objects to gain a better understanding of what went on Talon 4. But one may argue even that's not essential in garnering a baseline understanding that the planet has certainly been ravaged by some great force. But the first half of Act 2 has Samus recollecting much of her old tech and abilities, scouring both the Magmore caverns and the Phendrana drifts alike. This whole mission to retrieve her tech can also be associated with a type of coming of age or rising to the occasion, a child becoming an adult. The story then reaches a pinch, indicated by the introduction of Metroids in a space pirate lab, but that's not necessarily the midpoint. The game's midpoint is when Samus makes a return to the remains of the Orpheon and journeys into the Phazon mines. And note that the midpoint of a story is indicated by revelation that changes the course of the story. And what's remarkable about this game's story is the developers made the Orpheon both the start of the game and the midpoint of Samus' journey. At the Phazon mines, Samus learns about the outcome of the Phazon experimentation project, including the development of Metroid Prime, a creature that had come to Talon 4 with the meteor. And so Samus delves deeper into the mines and she fights through many Phazon-enhanced pirates until she finally encounters the monstrous Omega Pirate. Second plot point is reached when Samus destroys the Omega Pirate. There's a brief scare where the Omega Pirate seems to crush Samus in the wake of its death, but there Samus arises anew and her suit has been corrupted by Phazon. Act 1 ended with Samus losing everything, while Act 3 begins with Samus having reobtained all her old tech, plus more. And as we continue into Act 3 proper, Samus then discovers that the artifact temple that Chozo built was in fact made specifically to contain Metroid Prime and stop the Phazon from spreading all over the planet. And thus all main driving forces of the story are brought to their most intense point, and the most dramatic of questions have been answered. Now much of Act 3 may be spent performing tasks commonly associated with Metroidvania, re-exploration of previous areas, and uncovering what could not be accessed before. And so Samus is made to collect a number of artifacts, all intent on gaining access to the meteor's impact crater. That entire endeavor builds into the game's climax. But even after placing all the artifacts, Meta Ridley appears and attacks Samus. And it's there the developers do something amazing by repeating the events of the game's opening. You see, Ridley's introduction heralded Samus' loss of powers back at the frigate in Act 1. And here in Act 3, Ridley is brought back and intends on reversing whatever progress the player had made in collecting the Chozo artifacts. But he's also delaying the game's climax, which ought to provoke the player fiercely. And true, Meta Ridley only appears a select few times in the game. Yet he is a villain solidified in our minds simply because his very presence impedes the Act 3 transitionary period towards the story's climax. At this point in the game, we are desperate for a resolution, and Meta Ridley is all that stands in our way to achieving that. All this is to say that Meta Ridley is an ass, and the developers of Metroid Prime are geniuses for constructing the story in such a manner as to make his contribution memorable. if brief. Inevitably, however, Samus does defeat Meta Ridley and enters the Impact Crater, where she finds, fights, and defeats Metroid Prime. And there, the story really and truly does achieve its climax. Now, while this is a brief overview, a more in-depth analysis of Metroid Prime might see its Metrovania uncovering even more significant chiastic structures within the game's story. But my rundown of the events here are solely to show how video games can and have built themselves on classic dramatic structures. This stuff can be done. Metroid Prime's story was built on a singular, if simplistic purpose, finding and destroying Metroid Prime. And from there, every event in the game works to strengthen that focal point.